What's up? This is Peter with Shoot the Message, and this is the week in Misinformation. Now, this week we're talking about why everything is so expensive, and the misconceptions, the reasons that it's not so expensive. How much does a bottle of milk cost? This is a beautiful question. It's become a very popular gotcha for politicians and other big public figures who want to seem relatable. It's so sensational because the average person knows exactly how much a bottle of milk costs. Life teaches it to you pretty much instantly when you begin shopping for yourself. And who doesn't shop for themselves? Well, fabulously rich people. People who, by some miracle, never have to think about how expensive something is. People who don't have to look at price tags. They're few, they're far between, and we will never understand their lifestyle. But can you answer it now? Things have changed, and every week that price of milk seems to change with it. Things have become increasingly difficult, and when you look into the topic, when you try to find out when things might end, we receive a more and more, how can you put it, pessimistic message. When you look at TV, when you look to experts, there always seems to be a talking head who tells you that there's no end in sight. The fact is, we actually are formulating an end in sight, and things aren't that bad if you know the cause of our current issues and where they're going. So what is inflation, first of all? Let's quickly clear this up. So there are two major causes of inflation. One of them is when there's too much money going around, and it kind of reduces the value of that money, and it tends to encourage things to be more expensive. The other cause of inflation is when it's too easy to borrow money. Now, why is this? It generally begins with the supply and demand of things. So either things get more expensive because people are buying an unusual amount of it. This is called demand pull inflation. Or there's unusually less supply, and this is called cost push inflation. So because things are more expensive, people are spending more money, and your country has to print out more of that money. And this kind of encourages that cycle of the price of things going up and the value of your money going down. It's kind of like when a fruit comes in season suddenly, and all of a sudden you notice that it's cheaper against your dollar. You're not receiving less money at work, but you can buy more avocados now. So it's, in a way, inflation is kind of a cute way to say that your wages at work aren't worth as much because your coin is now in that situation of the fruit that's in season. Now, to understand how we fix this and how it gets out of control, you have to understand that the biggest spending in society actually comes from people who borrow. This isn't coming from you going to the store and buying a couple of avocados. More so, it's the store that buys a couple thousand avocados and might use them all. In fact, the more likely it is that the store is going to sell out of avocados, sell all of them, the more expensive they become because they've become a little bit rare. You see that constant there? You know, things becoming rare, things becoming common, and what that kind of does to your dollar or your dollar against them. Now, the way we try to keep it balanced is by setting an interest rate, which is a country's kind of agreement on how much you're going to pay back the bank every year extra to kind of make it worth the bank's while. At the moment, in the developed world, we like giving the bank 2% extra every year as a kind of sweetener, and also to kind of keep up with a normal rate of inflation, which we like having around 2%. We like our country getting 2% wealthier every year so that we print like 2% more money. So as you can imagine, if there are times when people aren't spending that much money, we kind of bring down that interest rate and encourage big companies or people buying houses, which are as expensive as they've ever been in history, to borrow more often and kind of kickstart that economy and create situations where we can have more jobs. And well, what's a low spending situation? Everyone being at home during a pandemic, not allowed to go out as much as usual because it'll kill grandma indirectly. So we found ourselves in that very situation in early 2020. And in fact, the two worst days on financial record, it wasn't during the Depression. Number one and number two were both in March 2020. We saw this big market crash, and what comes with a market crash is because you have businesses disappearing, like big deals have stopped happening. So the interest rate goes right down, and we encourage people to borrow. And this is what was happening. In fact, it was even easier to get a place. It was easier to rent. Although house prices kind of stayed the same, if not went up, but that's a different story about a different broken system. So we found ourselves ambling along. The interest rates in a lot of places were the lowest in history. For its own reasons, America was printing a lot of money during COVID, so it had an inflation problem early on. That also is another story. It's very complicated. This whole thing is a Gordian knot of issues because as we emerged out of the worst of COVID and those lockdowns began to simmer down as we became more immune to the virus, a big message started going around that you should support your local businesses. So we got out there, we started spending way more, and that is around the time that Russia invaded one of the world's biggest sources of wheat and minerals. So in terms of a sudden rush of spending and these conditions that create inflation and making things more expensive, all of a sudden you have some of the most important things in the world being stopped from coming to you. Between war, between being blown up, between half the world boycotting Russia's own stuff so that they had to get gas and oil from different places, and those local supplies began to dry up, as well as the places now getting their gas and oil and wheat and everything else from different places, having to find new routes and finding that this new type of export is way more expensive. But hey, what do you give a world that has an unmitigated pandemic and a sudden invasion of a couple of the most important countries for resources? You give them natural disasters. All of a sudden in 2022, we saw this spate of floods and fires and cyclones, a few other things. You may call them hurricanes where you are. Where I am at the moment, we have a third consecutive year of La Nina, which has caused quite a few floods. And now, not only are crops failing, not only is the supply of livestock beginning to slow down, but roads are being cut off. So for all these reasons, your supply of local stuff is drying up and becoming more expensive, and you're relying more on imports, which are more expensive because they've gone through more sets of hands. And fun fact, one major cause of inflation is how much inflation the average person expects. So your households, your people buying houses, your people borrowing, tend to plan for how expensive they think things will be in the near future. If they think things are more expensive, they'll slow down, tighten their belts, and stop contributing to inflation. Well, we didn't see any of this coming. So that's the major knot of causes of inflation right now. But what's not causing it? Well, specific politicians. This is a really popular misconception because it's easy to blame a certain person. I've spoken quite a bit about how propaganda works on individual cases, when you can point to one death, when you can point to one incompetent leader, one source of anger. It's very easy to direct that anger into action. And in this case, we're seeing a lot of those calls to action from rival political parties. So Joe Biden does not have a petrol more expensive button. Who else? Justin Trudeau is a major source of blame. You'll actually see, interestingly, even in European media, people mention the leader of a very specific state in Australia named Daniel Andrews. This is because he had quite a few lockdowns during COVID, and it was quite effective, but there was a little disagreement between epidemiologists about whether there needed to be that many lockdowns. Regardless of the means, the ends worked. Now, the thing you need to understand about the decisions of these leaders is that it's not necessarily the decisions of the leaders. This actually came from a combination of epidemiologists' input, economists' input, and supercomputers. They went to the major universities, each of which has a supercomputer on its premises, and they loaded in all these different situations, all these different possible outcomes. They tested hundreds and hundreds of these scenarios that might happen in the case of not just COVID, but the economic fallout, and they found out the best way to deal with it in a far quicker time than people could work through that. This is actually one reason as well why the vaccines came so fast. Just a massive amount of testing using the best technology available. So you have to understand that the best means possible were being used by just hundreds and thousands of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The world leaders largely were kind of hands off about this whole thing. The other thing that is not causing the inflation crisis is welfare. There's a fairly popular bit of rhetoric going around that giving people free money will encourage them to be lazy and not contribute to the economy. In fact, we've found it's the opposite. A key tenet of the Keynesian economy kind of strategy that got us out of the Great Depression and got some countries out of the Great Recession of 2008 relatively untouched was giving everyone a little bit of money and saying, hey, spend this in your local community. Which is an interesting thing when you realize that so much of this economic stimulus and economic problems indeed come from borrowing. The solution turned out to be regular people just giving money to their local businesses, keeping them going, putting them in a position where they could create jobs, create movement, and keep everyone well fed, well sheltered, etc., and so on and so on. So whose fault is it? It's funny, I'm not a blame person, but the more I look into this, the more I see economists saying very similar things, which is that the people who control the interest rates, the rate we give the bank each year, should have really brought up those numbers much sooner. As soon as we started kind of getting out of COVID, it should have been harder to borrow money. It should have been more expensive, and the bank should have had a higher standard for whom they gave big loans. The other one, of course, is this class of investors and businesses who are encouraged to charge exactly as much as a person is willing to pay. So you find in this neoliberal situation that people don't pay, a fixed, comfortable market rate for the bare necessities of life, but rather we look at people who need bare necessities and we ask, what have you got? And this results in a situation where houses in many cultural centers of the world are over $1 million each. You look at the rent in a region and it tends to be the exact maximum that a person can pay before they go into rental stress. And likewise, we see similar things happening with petrol, with gas, you may call it in your country. There's a set rate. There's actually an international cartel who decide the prices, but they are influenced by a few disparate groups. And some of them actually, during COVID and after, decided it would be fun to price gouge a little bit. And this has contributed to the big diplomatic controversy that has led to people looking for oil from other sources and a lot of the problems with Russia, because Saudi Arabia was one of those people who really tried to renegotiate with other big players in OPEC, such as America. What fixes this whole thing? Well, good news. It's exactly what we're doing now. You slowly bring up that interest rate so that people are less and less encouraged to borrow, and the price of things gradually comes down a little bit as we wait for the world to kind of correct itself and for things to become less rare. Now, there are very few of these problems I've just gone over that have no end in sight. The Ukraine war and conflicts like it that cut off our resources are so internationally unpopular that they're basically unwinnable. And these wars of attrition, where the entire world funds the side that didn't start it, are going to have to fall off eventually. One thing that is kind of unavoidable is that there will be more natural disasters. We have had multiple generations of people aware of climate change who have decided on that. But one of the consequences of that is that we know they're coming and we can adjust those inflation expectations accordingly. So, in fact, what's happening here is that we are moving toward the end of high prices. It's just taking a long time because the people who move those gears took a little too long. Oh, and if you're England, times everything I said times 10. That includes the risk of recession. Was that helpful? I run a media literacy platform called Shoot the Message. I basically help people stay safe and informed in a world where messages are everything. Hit the links below, hit them now while it's fresh in your mind.